The twin sons of Vescar cast long shadows over the dusty colony outpost. The settlement was old, built during the first human expansion into this part of the galaxy. Time had not been kind to it. The metal buildings were rusted, the streets were cracked, and the people who lived there had grown hard and suspicious. At the center of the outpost, near the old market, Cirrus Veleri walked carefully, feeling the weight of many eyes on her. She was not human, and that made her a target. Cirrus was a Veleri, a species known for their tall, slender forms, glowing blue skin, and intricate facial markings. Her silver-white hair flowed behind her as she moved, and her bright violet eyes scanned the street ahead. She knew this was a risk, but she had no choice. She needed supplies. The tension in the air was thick. The humans at the market stood still, their conversations stopping as she walked past. Some whispered, others just stared. She could feel their fear. "Aliens don't belong here," a voice muttered from a nearby stall. Cirrus ignored it and kept walking. She was used to this reaction. Many humans still held anger toward her people after the border wars, even though the conflict had ended years ago. But she wasn't here to cause trouble. She just needed medical supplies for a small clinic outside the colony. At a supply shop, an old man behind the counter frowned. "You got credits." Cirrus nodded and placed a small chip on the counter. "I just need basic medical packs." The man hesitated. "I don't sell to your kind." Cirrus felt a wave of frustration, but kept her voice calm. "I will pay double." Before the man could respond, a group of soldiers walked into the shop. Sergeant Cade, a broad-shouldered man with a scar across his cheek, stopped when he saw Cirrus. His eyes narrowed. "Well, well," Cade said. "What do we have here?" Cirrus didn't like his tone. She turned to leave, but Cade stepped in front of her. His men spread out, blocking the exit. "You lost, Veleri?" Cade asked, smirking. "Or are you spying for your people?" Cirrus sighed. "I just need medical supplies. I don't want trouble." Cade chuckled. "Too late for that." He glanced at his men. "You know, I lost friends in the war. A lot of us did. And now you just walk in here like you belong." Cirrus met his gaze. "The war is over." Cade's smirk disappeared. "Not for us." His hand twitched toward his sidearm. Cirrus tensed. The situation was getting worse. If they attacked, she could defend herself, but she didn't want to start a fight. Then, a voice came from the shop's entrance. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." The room fell silent. Cirrus turned her head and felt relief. Standing in the doorway was Captain Daniel Reeves. He was tall, wearing worn combat armor, and had a commanding presence. His short, dark hair was slightly messy, and his sharp green eyes locked onto Cade with cold intensity. "Captain," one of Cade's men stammered. Cade frowned. "This isn't your problem, Reeves." Daniel stepped forward, his movements slow but deliberate. He looked at Cirrus for a brief moment, checking if she was hurt. Then he turned his attention back to Cade. "Actually, it is my problem," Daniel said, "because that woman is my wife." The room froze. Cade's men stared in shock. The shopkeeper's mouth fell open. Even Cade looked stunned for a moment before his expression turned into disgust and anger. "You married a Veleri?" Cade asked. His voice was filled with disbelief. Daniel's jaw tightened. "Yeah, and you were about to make a big mistake." Cade scoffed. "You expect me to believe that a Terran soldier, one of our best, chose to be with an alien?" Daniel stepped even closer, now only inches from Cade. His voice was calm, but there was an edge of warning in it. "I don't care what you believe," Daniel said, "but if you or your men touch her, I promise you'll regret it." Cade's men looked nervous. They knew who Daniel was. He wasn't just any soldier, he was a legend, a former Terran shock trooper, trained for the hardest battles. He had fought enemies far deadlier than them, and he had never lost. Cade clenched his fists. His pride was wounded, but he knew this was not the time to fight. Not here. not against him. Fine, Cade muttered, but this isn't over. He turned and left, his men following. Saris let out a slow breath. The tension in the shop eased. Daniel turned to her. Are you okay? She nodded. I'm fine. He gave her a small smile. Let's get what you need and get out of here. The shopkeeper, still in shock, quickly handed over the supplies without another word. As Daniel and Saris stepped outside, the sky above them darkened. A storm was coming, and not just in the weather. Because now, Cade had a personal reason to come after them, and he wouldn't stop until he got revenge. The dusty streets of Vescarnine were quieter than usual. Word had already spread across the colony outpost. Sergeant Cade had tried to intimidate an alien woman, but things didn't go as planned. Because that alien woman was the wife of Captain Daniel Reeves. At the local barracks, Cade sat at a metal table, his jaw tight with anger. His men sat around him, nervous and silent. He had been humiliated in front of everyone. We should have just handled her before Reeves showed up, one soldier muttered. Cade's fingers drummed on the table. He was furious. Furious that Reeves had embarrassed him. Furious that a human war hero had married a Velari. This isn't over, Cade growled. No human should stand with aliens, especially not him. One of his men hesitated before speaking. Captain Reeves is a Terran shock trooper. If we go after him, it won't end well for us. Cade's eyes narrowed. You think I'm scared of him? The soldier didn't answer, but everyone in the room knew the truth. Daniel Reeves wasn't just a soldier, he was one of the best. The kind of warrior who survived battles that no one else could. But Cade refused to back down. His pride wouldn't let him. We hit him where it hurts, Cade said, leaning forward. We wait. When he's not around, we make the Velari girl disappear. Quietly. The room was silent. A few of the soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. Cade slammed his fist on the table. I want every patrol to watch them. The moment he leaves, we strike. Outside the barracks, the wind picked up. A sandstorm was coming, but it wasn't the only storm that would hit Vescarnine. The warning. Saris sat inside their small home, packing the medical supplies Daniel had helped her buy. Their house was modest, built from repurposed metal and stone, but it was warm and safe. Outside, the desert wind howled. Daniel stood by the window, watching the streets carefully. He had seen Cade's face when he left the market. That wasn't the look of a man who would let things go. They'll come for you, Daniel said quietly. Saris paused. She wasn't surprised. I know. Daniel turned to her. Then we need to be ready. She looked up at him, her violet eyes filled with concern. I don't want more violence. Daniel sighed and sat beside her. He took her hands gently. I don't want it either. But people like Cade, they don't stop until someone makes them stop. Saris squeezed his hand. We can leave. Daniel shook his head. Running won't change anything. They'll just go after someone else, someone without a soldier to protect them. She knew he was right. Daniel leaned in, his voice low but firm. Listen to me. If they try to take you, they'll regret it. I'll make sure of that. Saris nodded, trusting him completely. But in her heart, she wished things could be different. The trap. The next day, Daniel had to leave the colony for a few hours to meet with a supply convoy outside the perimeter. He didn't like leaving Saris alone, but they needed the supplies. Lock the doors, he told her before leaving. If anything happens, use the communicator and call me. Saris nodded and kissed his cheek. Be careful. Daniel gave her a small smile before stepping outside and disappearing into the swirling desert winds. As soon as he was gone, Cade's men moved in. Saris felt it before she saw them. A strange stillness in the air, the kind of silence that meant danger was near. Then, a sharp knock at the door. She didn't answer. Instead, she reached for the small plasma pistol Daniel had left her. Another knock. This time harder. Then a voice. Saris Velderi opened the door. She recognized it. Cade. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. I have no reason to speak with you, Sergeant. A low chuckle came from outside. You don't have a choice. She didn't move. Seconds passed. Then, boom. The door exploded inward as a charge detonated, sending smoke and debris everywhere. Saris was thrown back, her ears ringing. Through the smoke, Cade and 3 soldiers stepped in, weapons drawn. Saris let out a slow breath. The tension in the shop eased. Daniel turned to her. Are you okay? She nodded. I'm fine. He gave her a small smile. Let's get what you need and get out of here. The shopkeeper, still in shock, quickly handed over the supplies without another word. As Daniel and Saris stepped outside, the sky above them darkened. A storm was coming, and not just in the weather. Because now, Cade had a personal reason to come after them. And he wouldn't stop until he got revenge. The dusty streets of Veskar 9 were quieter than usual. Word had already spread across the colony outpost. Sergeant Cade had tried to intimidate an alien woman, but things didn't go as planned. Because that alien woman was the wife of Captain Daniel Reeves. At the local barracks, Cade sat at a metal table, his jaw tight with anger. His men sat around him, nervous and silent. He had been humiliated in front of everyone. We should have just handled her before Reeves showed up, one soldier muttered. Cade's fingers drummed on the table. He was furious. Furious that Reeves had embarrassed him. Furious that a human war hero had married a Veleri. This isn't over, Cade growled. No human should stand with aliens, especially not him. One of his men hesitated before speaking. Captain Reeves is a Terran shock trooper. If we go after him, it won't end well for us. Cade's eyes narrowed. You think I'm scared of him? The soldier didn't answer, but everyone in the room knew the truth. Daniel Reeves wasn't just a soldier, he was one of the best. The kind of warrior who survived battles that no one else could. But Cade refused to back down. His pride wouldn't let him. We hit him where it hurts, Cade said, leaning forward. We wait. When he's not around, we make the Velderi girl disappear. Quietly. The room was silent. A few of the soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. Cade slammed his fist on the table. I want every patrol to watch them. The moment he leaves, we strike. Outside the barracks, the wind picked up. A sandstorm was coming, but it wasn't the only storm that would hit Veskar 9. The warning. Saris sat inside their small home, packing the medical supplies Daniel had helped her buy. Their house was modest, built from repurposed metal and stone, but it was warm and safe. Outside, the desert wind howled. Daniel stood by the window, watching the streets carefully. He had seen Cade's face when he left the market. That wasn't the look of a man who would let things go. They'll come for you, Daniel said quietly. Saris paused. She wasn't surprised. I know. Daniel turned to her. Then we need to be ready. She looked up at him, her violet eyes filled with concern. I don't want more violence. Daniel sighed and sat beside her. He took her hands gently. I don't want it either. But people like Cade, they don't stop until someone makes them stop. Saris squeezed his hand. We can leave. Daniel shook his head. Running won't change anything. They'll just go after someone else, someone without a soldier to protect them. She knew he was right. Daniel leaned in, his voice low but firm. Listen to me. If they try to take you, they'll regret it. I'll make sure of that. Saris nodded, trusting him completely. But in her heart, she wished things could be different. The trap. The next day, Daniel had to leave the colony for a few hours to meet with a supply convoy outside the perimeter. He didn't like leaving Saris alone, but they needed the supplies. Lock the doors, he told her before leaving. If anything happens, use the communicator and call me. Saris nodded and kissed his cheek. Be careful. Daniel gave her a small smile before stepping outside and disappearing into the swirling desert winds. As soon as he was gone, Cade's men moved in. Ceres felt it before she saw them. A strange stillness in the air, the kind of silence that meant danger was near. Then, a sharp knock at the door. She didn't answer. Instead, she reached for the small plasma pistol Daniel had left her. Another knock, this time harder. Then, a voice. Ceres Velheri opened the door. She recognized it. Cade. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I have no reason to speak with you, Sergeant." A low chuckle came from outside. "You don't have a choice." She didn't move. Seconds passed. Then, boom! The door exploded inward as a charge detonated, sending smoke and debris everywhere. Ceres was thrown back, her ears ringing. Through the smoke, Cade and 3 soldiers stepped in, weapons drawn. "You're lucky," he said, "because I'm giving you a choice." Cade coughed and looked up. "What? What choice?" Daniel pointed to the unconscious soldiers on the ground. "You can take your men and walk away. Leave this colony. Never come back." Cade wiped blood from his mouth. "And if I don't?" Daniel's expression hardened. "Then next time, I won't be so kind." Cade's fists clenched. Humiliation burned inside him. But he knew the truth. He couldn't win against Daniel Reeves. Slowly, he stood up, his body aching. He looked at Ceres, then at Daniel. "This isn't over," Cade muttered. Daniel didn't answer. He just watched as Cade grabbed his fallen men and dragged them out of the house. Within moments, they were gone. A moment of peace. The house was silent again. The only sound was Ceres's slow breathing. Daniel turned to her. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head. "I'm fine." He studied her face, making sure. Then, finally, he let out a breath. The rage that had been burning inside him slowly faded. Ceres stepped closer and touched his arm. "Thank you." Daniel gave her a small smile. "Always." For a moment, they just stood there. The fight was over. For now. But Daniel knew this wasn't the end. Cade wouldn't let this go. And next time, he wouldn't come alone. In the shadows, far from the small house, Cade sat inside a dark alley, his rage boiling. His men groaned in pain beside him. But he didn't care. He had been humiliated, defeated, by a traitor who chose an alien over his own people. A deep hatred burned in Cade's chest. He needed more firepower, more men, and he knew exactly where to get them. Cade pulled out his communicator and sent a message. The response came almost immediately. A voice crackled through the speaker. "This better be important." Cade clenched his fists. "I need backup." There was a pause. Then the voice chuckled. "Backup? You in trouble, Sergeant." Cade's face darkened, not for long. The voice laughed again. "All right. We'll be there soon. Hope you're ready for a war." Cade smiled. Daniel Reeves had no idea what was coming. A heavy silence filled the small house as Ceres finished cleaning up the broken furniture. The door was damaged, the walls had burned marks from the explosion, and the floor still had traces of dust. Daniel sat at the table, deep in thought. His hands were clasped together, his expression unreadable. Ceres glanced at him. "You know he's coming back," she said softly. Daniel nodded. "I know." Cade was not the type to accept defeat. He would return, and this time, he wouldn't come alone. Daniel had seen that kind of hatred before, men who couldn't let go of their pride, who let their anger drive them to destruction. He couldn't let Ceres stay here. "We need to leave," Daniel said. "They'll attack soon, and I don't want you caught in the crossfire." Ceres shook her head. "No, this is our home. If we run now, they'll think they won." Daniel exhaled. He admired her strength, but he wasn't willing to risk her safety. Before he could argue, his communicator beeped. He picked it up. "Reeves." A voice crackled through the speaker. "Captain, it's Jonas. We have a problem." Jonas was an old friend, one of the few people Daniel still trusted in the colony. "What kind of problem?" Daniel asked. There was a pause. Then Jonas said, "Cade's calling in mercenaries." Daniel's jaw clenched. So that's how Cade wanted to play it. "How many?" Daniel asked. "At least a dozen," Jonas replied. "Maybe more. They'll be here by nightfall." Cyrus's face paled slightly, but she didn't say anything. Daniel stood up. His mind was already calculating. "Thanks for the warning." "Be careful," Jonas said. "Cade wants blood." The call ended. Daniel turned to Cyrus. "It's worse than I thought." Cyrus placed a hand on his arm. "Then we fight." Daniel looked at her, seeing the determination in her eyes. He had fought battles across the galaxy, against alien invaders, against enemy soldiers. But this, defending his home, felt different. He nodded. "We fight." Preparing for war. Daniel spent the next few hours gathering supplies. He had hidden weapons just in case something like this ever happened. He pulled out a pulse rifle, extra ammunition, grenades, and a combat knife. Cyrus checked the power packs for her plasma pistol. Her people were known for their precision and speed in combat, and while she preferred healing over fighting, she wasn't afraid to defend herself. As the sun began to set, Daniel set up traps around the house. Motion sensors, explosive charges, and smoke grenades. Then they waited. The attack begins. The first sign of trouble was the roar of an engine. Daniel peered out the window and saw them. Mercenaries in armored vehicles, rolling into the colony like they owned the place. Cade was with them, sitting in the lead vehicle, a cruel smile on his face. The people of the colony stayed inside, shutting their doors and windows. They knew what was coming and wanted no part in it. Daniel grabbed his rifle. "Stay behind cover," he told Cyrus. She nodded and crouched near a crate. The mercenaries stopped outside the house. Cade stepped out first, holding a megaphone. "Captain Reeves." His voice echoed. "You had your chance to walk away, but now you're done." Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he aimed his rifle. One of the mercenaries laughed. "He's not coming out." Cade smirked. "Then we drag him out." He raised his hand, and the mercenaries opened fire. Bullets and plasma rounds tore through the walls. The house shook under the assault. Smoke filled the air. Daniel stayed low, moving swiftly between cover. He waited for the right moment. Then he pressed a button. Outside, an explosive charge went off, flipping one of the mercenary vehicles. The explosion sent men flying. Gunfire stopped for a brief second, just enough time for Daniel to strike back. He rolled out from cover, his rifle spitting fire. His shots were precise, deadly. One mercenary fell, then another. Cade ducked behind cover, cursing. "Kill him already." The remaining mercenaries regrouped. They rushed the house. Cyrus fired her pistol, hitting one in the shoulder. Another mercenary kicked the door open, stepping inside. Daniel met him with a knife to the chest. The fight turned brutal. One mercenary swung at Daniel with a steel baton. Daniel dodged and slammed his rifle into the man's head. Another attacker grabbed Cyrus, trying to pin her down. She twisted, elbowed him in the throat, then shot him point blank. Outside, Cade watched in horror as his men were cut down. "This isn't possible," he muttered. Then Daniel stepped out of the smoke. His armor was scorched, his face smeared with dirt, but his green eyes burned with fury. Most of the mercenaries were dead or wounded. Cade staggered back. You're just one man." Daniel leveled his rifle at him. "And that was your mistake." Cade lunged for his gun. Bang! A single shot rang out. Cade collapsed, clutching his leg, screaming in pain. Daniel walked up to him, standing over his fallen body. "This was never your fight," Daniel said coldly. "But you made it one." Cade gasped, his face twisted in agony. You think you've won. Daniel knelt beside him. If you come back, I won't aim for your leg next time. Cade's eyes widened. He saw the truth in Daniel's expression. Fear replaced his anger. Daniel stood up. The few surviving mercenaries dragged Cade away, their faces pale. The battle was over. Daniel turned back to the house, where Cirrus stood waiting. He walked toward her, pulling her into an embrace. "We did it," she whispered. Daniel exhaled. For now, because he knew this wasn't just about Cade. There were others out there, people who wouldn't accept what he and Cirrus had. But tonight, they had won. And as long as he lived, no one would take his home away from him. The battlefield was silent. Smoke still rose from the wreckage outside the house. The ground was littered with broken weapons, burnt-out vehicles, and the bodies of the fallen mercenaries. The few survivors had fled, dragging their wounded away. And Cade was gone. Daniel stood at the edge of the battlefield, his rifle still in his hands. His muscles ached. His body was covered in dust and sweat, but his mind was sharp. He was waiting, watching, for any sign of another attack. Beside him, Cirrus surveyed the damage. Her golden eyes were calm, but he knew she was troubled. "This won't be the last time," she said softly. Daniel sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "No, it won't." The colony had been silent during the battle. The people had hidden, locking their doors, staying out of the fight. But now, slowly, they were coming out. Jonas was the first to approach. The older man's face was grim. He looked at the destruction, then at Daniel. "You really did it," Jonas muttered. "Took on Cade and a group of mercenaries. And won." Daniel didn't answer. He wasn't thinking about victory. He was thinking about what came next. Jonas crossed his arms. "You know Cade won't forget this. He'll tell others. The wrong kind of people. And when they come back." Daniel met his eyes. "Then we'll be ready." Jonas studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right. But if you're staying here, you need more than just weapons. You need allies." Daniel knew he was right. He couldn't fight every battle alone. Cirrus stepped forward. "The Vel-Eri have connections," she said. "We could call for help." Jonas hesitated. "You trust her people?" Daniel gave him a sharp look. "I trust her." Jonas nodded slowly. "Then let's start preparing." The warning. The night was quiet, but Daniel couldn't sleep. He sat outside, his rifle across his lap, scanning the horizon. Cirrus joined him, wrapping a light blanket around her shoulders. "You should rest," she said. He shook his head. "Can't." She sat beside him. "Because of Cade." Daniel exhaled. "Because of what's coming next." Cirrus leaned against him, her warmth comforting. "You've fought worse," she said softly. He nodded. "But not like this. Not at home." Cirrus was silent for a moment. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small silver communication device. "What's that?" Daniel asked. She hesitated, then placed it in his hand. "A distress beacon. It's linked to my people." Daniel frowned. "You've had this the whole time." She nodded. "I didn't use it before because I wanted to live here, to be part of this world with you. But if we're in danger, I will call them." Daniel studied the device. It was small, but he knew it could send a message across the stars. He looked at her. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "If Cade returns with an army, we can't face them alone." Daniel considered for a long moment. Then he pressed the button. A soft blue light blinked. The message was sent. Now, all they could do was wait. Trouble on the horizon. The next morning, the colony was tense. Word of the battle had spread. Some people were relieved that Daniel had fought back. Others were afraid. Jonas gathered a small group of colonists. "If more mercenaries come, we need to defend ourselves," he said. "Who's willing to stand?" A few people stepped forward. Some were former soldiers, others were just tired of being afraid. Daniel nodded. Good. I'll train you. Before they could discuss more, a loud beeping came from the colony's main gate. Daniel's body went rigid. He and Jonas hurried to the entrance. A small scout drone hovered in the air, its metal surface reflecting the sunlight. Jonas cursed. That's not ours. Daniel's gut tightened. He recognized the design. It wasn't from Cade's group. It belonged to someone worse. A deep metallic voice came from the drone. Daniel Reeves, we know you're here. Daniel's grip on his rifle tightened. We heard about what happened to Cade's mercenaries. Interesting. Very interesting. Jonas whispered, Who is this? Daniel didn't answer. He already knew. A warlord. A powerful one. The voice continued. You made enemies, soldier, and soon you will see their wrath. The drone's eye flashed red, then it exploded. The shockwave knocked them back. Smoke filled the air. Jonas coughed. What? What was that? Daniel clenched his jaw. A message. Cirrus ran to his side. Who was it? Daniel exhaled slowly. A warlord named Terak. He's one of the most dangerous men in the sector. Jonas swallowed. And now he knows about us. Cirrus looked at Daniel. What do we do? Daniel's face was hard as stone. We get ready. He turned to the colonists. Terak won't wait. He'll come fast and hard. If we don't prepare now, we won't survive. Jonas nodded. Then we better start. Cirrus touched Daniel's hand. My people will come, she said. We won't fight alone. Daniel squeezed her hand. He hoped she was right. Because soon, the real war would begin. The sun was setting behind the colony, casting long shadows over the dusty streets. The air was thick with tension. Daniel stood on the colony's wall, his rifle slung over his shoulder. His sharp green eyes scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of Terak's forces. Nothing yet, but they were coming. Behind him, Jonas and a small group of colonists were working, setting up defenses, reinforcing the walls, and placing explosive charges around the perimeter. Jonas wiped sweat from his brow. We're doing what we can, he said. But if Terak brings a full army, we won't last long. Daniel nodded. That's why we need to hold them off until reinforcements arrive. Cirrus had sent the distress signal to her people. Now, they could only hope the Velderi fleet would arrive in time. Cirrus walked up beside Daniel, her expression calm but serious. I spoke with some of the colonists, she said. Some are scared, but they will fight. Daniel glanced at her. Good. She touched his arm. We'll make it through this. He gave her a small smile. We have to. The first attack. The night was quiet. Too quiet. Then, a low rumbling sound broke the silence. Daniel's body tensed. He raised his rifle, looking into the darkness. Jonas cursed. They're here. A fleet of dark ships appeared over the hills. Their engines roared, and the ground trembled under their weight. Daniel counted at least 10 troop transports and 2 armored vehicles. Terak wasn't taking any chances. Cirrus inhaled sharply. That's more than I expected. Daniel tightened his grip on his weapon. Then we make them regret coming here. The enemy ships landed. The doors opened, and black armored soldiers poured out, weapons glowing in the dark. At the front of the army stood a tall figure in red and black armor. Terak. His voice echoed across the battlefield. Daniel Reeves. Step forward and surrender. Make this easy on yourself. Daniel exhaled. Then he raised his rifle and fired the first shot. The battle begins. The colony erupted into chaos. Daniel's shot hit the ground near Terak's feet, and the warlord let out a growl of anger. Kill them all. Terak roared. His soldiers charged. Daniel ducked behind cover, firing his rifle with deadly precision. The colonists returned fire, their weapons lighting up the night. Jonas tossed a grenade. It exploded, sending enemy soldiers flying. Cirrus moved swiftly, her plasma pistol burning through enemy armor. She dodged, rolled, and fired, her movements faster than the human eye could track. Despite their numbers, the colonists fought back hard. Daniel's heart pounded. He had fought wars before, but this was different. This time, he wasn't fighting for a mission. He was fighting for his home. Terek joins the fight. The battle raged on. Terek watched from a distance, his red eyes glowing under his helmet. Then, with a growl, he pulled out a massive energy sword and marched forward. Daniel saw him coming. "Jonas," Daniel shouted, "cover me." Jonas nodded and provided suppressing fire as Daniel ran toward Terek. Terek's soldiers tried to stop him, but Daniel moved like a ghost, dodging bullets and cutting them down with precise shots. Then he was face to face with Terek. The warlord smirked. "I've heard stories about you, Captain Reeves." He raised his sword. "Let's see if they're true." Daniel didn't waste time talking. He attacked. He fired 3 shots. Terek blocked them with his sword, the energy field deflecting the bullets. Terek swung. Daniel dodged, barely avoiding the blade as it cut through the air. Daniel knew he couldn't win this fight with a rifle alone. He dropped his gun, pulled out his combat knife, and lunged. The 2 warriors clashed. The turning point. Daniel fought with everything he had. He ducked, dodged, and struck when he saw an opening. Terek was stronger, but Daniel was faster. Terek swung again. Daniel sidestepped and slashed his knife across Terek's armor, leaving a deep cut. The warlord staggered back. Daniel didn't let him recover. He kicked Terek's leg, forcing him to one knee. But before he could land the final blow, a loud explosion shook the ground. Daniel turned, his eyes widening. Above them, the sky was filled with ships. Cirrus gasped. The Velari fleet. They came. The enemy soldiers hesitated as the Velari warships descended. Then, bright energy beams rained down, obliterating Terek's reinforcements. Terek growled. "This isn't over." Daniel wiped the sweat from his brow. "Looks over to me." The warlord glared at him. Then, in a flash of red light, he activated. The explosion shattered the shield. Before Terek could react, Daniel rushed forward and plunged his knife into the warlord's chest. Terek gasped. His red eyes flickered. "This isn't over." Daniel twisted the knife. "Yes, it is." With a final breath, Terek fell to the ground. Escape and victory. The alarms grew louder. The base was seconds from exploding. Jonas shouted, "We need to go, now." Daniel grabbed Cirrus's hand. "Move." They sprinted back to the landing bay. Explosions rocked the station. Metal beams collapsed around them. The Velari dropship hovered just ahead, its ramp open. They jumped aboard just as the station erupted in fire. As the ship sped away, Daniel watched the base implode, disappearing into space. Terek was gone. For good. Cirrus exhaled. "It's over." Jonas laughed. "We actually did it." Daniel leaned back against the wall, exhausted but satisfied. "Yeah, we did." A new beginning. Back at the colony, the people celebrated. The danger was gone. They were free. Jonas raised a drink. To Daniel. To Cirrus. To the people who fought for this colony. The crowd cheered. Daniel smiled, but his eyes were on Cirrus. "You staying?" She grinned. "I told you. I want to live here. With you." He squeezed her hand. "Then let's build something worth protecting." The stars above shined brightly. The war was over. And now, a new future could begin. The teleportation device and vanished. His remaining soldiers saw their leader was gone, and they fled. The battle was over. Victory, but at a cost. Daniel stood in the center of the battlefield, breathing heavily. The colony was damaged, but it still stood. Jonas approached, his face covered in dirt and sweat. "We won." Daniel looked around at the fallen soldiers, the destroyed buildings, and the exhausted colonists. He nodded. Yeah, we did. Cirrus touched his arm. Your people fought well. Daniel smiled at her. So did yours. Above them, the Velderi fleet hovered, their presence a warning to any who would try to harm the colony again. For now, they were safe. But Daniel knew the fight wasn't over. Terek was still out there, and he wouldn't forget this. Daniel looked at Cirrus, then at the people around him. They had won this battle. Now they had to prepare for the war. The battle was over, but the war was not. Daniel stood on the colony wall, looking at the destruction below. Fires still burned. Buildings were damaged. The air smelled of smoke and metal. The people had survived, but at a cost. Beside him, Cirrus watched the sky. The Velderi fleet hovered above, their sleek ships gleaming under the sunlight. Their arrival had saved the colony, but Daniel knew Terek was still out there. He won't stop, Cirrus said softly. Daniel nodded. No, he won't. Jonas approached, his face grim. We need to rebuild, but people are scared. They know Terek will come back. Daniel turned to him. Then we get ready. Next time, we finish this. The hunt begins. 2 days passed. The colony worked hard to repair the damage. The Velderi stayed, helping with supplies and protection. But Daniel couldn't rest. He knew Terek was planning something bigger. Then, the message came. A distorted voice echoed through the colony's communication system. Daniel Reeves, you think this is over? I will return, and when I do, I will burn your colony to the ground. It was Terek. Daniel clenched his fists. Where is he? One of the Velderi commanders, a tall alien named Valen, stepped forward. We traced the signal. It came from a station near the asteroid belt. Daniel looked at Cirrus. If we hit him first, we end this. Cirrus nodded. I'll come with you. Jonas stepped forward. So will I. Daniel looked around at the faces of the people who had fought beside him. He had never felt more certain. This is our fight, he said. We take the battle to Terek. Infiltrating Terek's base. The Velderi dropship flew fast and low through space. Daniel, Cirrus, Jonas, and a small group of elite fighters were on board. The target, Terek's hidden base on an asteroid. The plan was simple. Get inside, take out Terek, and end the threat once and for all. As the ship neared the station, Cirrus checked her plasma pistol. No turning back now. Daniel smirked. Wouldn't want to. The dropship landed silently on the asteroid's surface. The team moved quickly, sneaking past patrols. The base was heavily guarded, but Daniel's experience made him the perfect leader for this mission. They reached the entrance. Jonas planted a small explosive. Boom! The doors blasted open, and the team rushed inside. Terek's men reacted fast, but Daniel was faster. He fired precise shots, taking down guards one by one. Cirrus moved like a shadow, her plasma pistol cutting through the enemy. Jonas covered their backs. We need to find Terek before he escapes. Daniel pushed forward. Then let's move. The final battle. They'd reached the command center. The doors slid open, revealing Terek standing at the center of the room. He turned, his red eyes burning with fury. You just don't know when to quit, he growled. Daniel stepped forward, his rifle aimed. Neither do you. Terek smirked. That's why I win. He pressed a button on his gauntlet. The room shook. Alarms blared. Jonas cursed. What did he do? Cirrus's eyes widened. He's setting the base to self-destruct. Terek lunged at Daniel with his energy sword. Daniel dodged, rolling to the side and firing. The shots bounced off Terek's armor. Terek swung. Daniel barely blocked the attack with his knife, the force knocking him back. Cirrus fired at Terek, but the warlord activated a shield, deflecting the shots. Jonas ran to the control panel. I can't stop the explosion. Daniel growled. Then we finish this. Now. Tarak charged again. Daniel dodged left, then right, searching for an opening. Then he saw it. The shield had a weak spot on the left side. Daniel dropped his rifle, grabbed a grenade, and threw it directly at the weak point. Boom!